Mrs. Whitmore, I noticed something disturbing in your son's wedding photographs. For a second, I thought I had misheard him. I was standing barefoot in my kitchen, 3 weeks after Ethan's wedding, holding a mug of coffee I'd already reheated twice. Outside the windows, Charleston was disappearing beneath a gray afternoon rain. The man on the phone was Caleb Foster, the photographer Madison had hired for the wedding. What kind of disturbing? I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation frightened me more than the words. I'd rather not speculate. I'm finishing the gallery, and there are several photographs I think you should see first. My mind immediately went somewhere ugly. An affair. Ethan kissing someone he shouldn't have kissed. Madison disappearing with another man. Some drunken moment nobody remembered. Then Caleb said something stranger. Do you remember where you kept your purse during the reception? I stopped breathing for half a second. Yes. Was it ever left in the bridal suite? The coffee mug suddenly felt heavy in my hand. Yes. Another pause. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm sending you one photograph now. My phone vibrated. I opened the image. At first, I saw nothing alarming. Madison's cousin was laughing in the foreground. Behind her, the bridal suite door stood partly open. Then I enlarged the background. My purse was sitting on a chair. Open. A man's hand hovered above it. And beneath that hand were several sheets of paper I recognized immediately. Company documents. 3 weeks earlier, I had been too busy trying to convince myself that my son's wedding was the beginning of something beautiful to notice how many warning signs were sitting right in front of me. Whitmore Custom Homes had been my life for 27 years. My husband, Thomas, and I had started the company with 1 pickup truck, 2 subcontractors, and a second mortgage we were terrified to tell our parents about. By the time Thomas died 6 years ago, we were building luxury homes throughout the Charleston area and employing 43 people. Ethan grew up inside that company. At 31, he was our operations manager, and he was good at it. But being good had never been enough for him. He wanted people to forget he was the owner's son. That insecurity was the one thing I had never figured out how to help him overcome. And Richard Clark figured it out within months. Richard was Madison's father. He was 61, handsome in that polished, silver-haired way that made people assume competence before he had demonstrated any. He called himself a business consultant and spoke about companies the way surgeons spoke about difficult operations. At the rehearsal dinner, I watched him hand Ethan a long black box. Something for tomorrow, Richard said. Inside was an engraved fountain pen. Ethan laughed. You know nobody signs marriage licenses at the altar anymore, right? Richard smiled. It's not for the marriage license. It's for everything that comes after. A man should have a good pen when he finally starts signing his own future. Everyone laughed. I did too. But Ethan looked at that pen longer than the joke deserved. I didn't understand why that bothered me at the time. The next morning, Claire noticed it too. Claire Whitmore was Thomas's younger sister and the bookkeeper at Whitmore Custom Homes. She could spot a $6 accounting error from across the room and had the unfortunate habit of treating suspicious people like suspicious invoices. What exactly does Madison's father do? She asked while we waited for the ceremony. Consulting. That means nothing. Claire. I'm serious. He advises companies. So do bartenders. I nearly laughed. Then she nodded across the room. Richard was talking quietly with Ethan. Your son has spent more time talking business with that man this week than he has with you. That irritated me because it was true. For months, Ethan had been pushing me to speed up the succession plan. Thomas and I had always intended for him to inherit the company. I had already planned to transfer a substantial ownership stake after the wedding, followed by additional voting rights once an independent financial review was completed. It wasn't punishment. It was protection. For Ethan. For our employees. For everything Thomas and I had built. Richard saw it differently. 2 nights before the wedding, he had poured me a glass of wine and said, 40% is enough responsibility to feel the pressure, Rebecca, but not enough control to make the decisions. I remember staring at him. I had never told him Ethan's percentage. Madison told you? Richard barely blinked. Ethan may have mentioned it. Then he smiled and changed the subject. I let him. That was my mistake. I wanted Madison's family to feel welcome. More than that, I wanted Ethan's marriage to work. His father's death had changed him. He rarely talked about grief, but I knew he missed having someone who could approve of him without also being his boss. Richard stepped directly into that empty space. And I was so relieved Ethan had found another older man he respected that I ignored how quickly respect became influence. At the wedding reception, Richard seemed everywhere. He even asked Caleb to take more, candid family photographs, near the hallway outside the bridal suite. Not everything should look staged, Richard said. The best memories happen when nobody knows the camera is there. I remember thinking it was sentimental. Caleb apparently took him seriously. Around 9 that night, a server knocked a champagne flute onto the table near my chair. When I came back from dancing with Ethan, my purse was gone. Madison appeared moments later. One of the bridesmaids moved it, she told me. Champagne almost spilled all over it. She kissed my cheek. I put it somewhere safe. The bridal suite. I thanked her. Inside that purse were the transfer documents I had brought for my attorney, who was attending the wedding. He had wanted to confirm one detail before our meeting the following week. I never imagined anyone would care about them. At the reception, Richard approached me again. Ethan tells me you're still requiring the financial review before transferring voting authority. His tone was casual. Yes. You don't trust him? I trust him enough to give him part of a company worth millions. That wasn't my question. I looked at him. Richard smiled pleasantly. Then I noticed his cuff links. Silver rectangles with a narrow black stripe through the center. Madison had given them to him that morning. Later, I would remember those cuff links better than I remembered the flowers, the cake, or even the song Ethan and Madison chose for their first dance. But that night, I dismissed Richard's comment. Again. 3 weeks later, standing in my kitchen, I stared at Caleb's photograph until my coffee went cold. I enlarged the image further. The person's face was outside the frame. Only the wrist and hand were visible. I called Caleb back. Could someone have been reaching for something else? That's what I wondered, he said. But this isn't the only picture. My stomach tightened. How many are there? At least 4. I sat down. Caleb explained that his camera had captured a burst of photographs while he followed Madison's cousins down the hallway. The bridal suite door happened to remain visible in the background. In the first image, my purse was closed. In the next, it was open. Then came the photograph I was looking at. And in another. Caleb stopped. What? I think the person is holding a phone over the documents. Every instinct I had spent 3 weeks suppressing suddenly came alive. Richard knowing Ethan's exact ownership percentage. The engraved pen. The constant conversations about control. My purse being moved. His strange interest in photographs near that hallway. And something else. 2 days after returning from his honeymoon, Ethan had walked into my office and said, "Mom, we need to change the timetable." He wanted controlling voting rights immediately. When I refused, his face hardened. You always find another reason I'm not ready. That isn't what I said. You never have to say it. At the time, I blamed wedding stress. Then Richard began visiting the office. Then Ethan stopped including me in certain meetings. Then, that morning, he had texted me asking whether I still had copies of our earlier ownership transfer drafts. I had stared at the message without understanding why he suddenly cared. Now I did. Or at least, I thought I did. "Caleb," I whispered, "send me everything." There was silence. Then he said, "There's one more thing." My pulse quickened. "What?" "I enlarged the clearest photograph before calling you. Whoever opened your purse is mostly outside the frame." "Mostly?" "You can see part of his sleeve." "His." "Not her." "A man." "And his wrist," Caleb continued. "There's something silver near the documents. I can't tell whether it's jewelry or part of the purse." Another image arrived. I opened it. The photograph was grainy from enlargement, but the scene was unmistakable. My purse. My confidential documents. A phone positioned directly above them. And beside the papers, catching the light from the bridal suite chandelier, was a small rectangular flash of silver crossed by a dark stripe. I knew that design. I had seen a pair exactly like it at the rehearsal dinner. And suddenly I wasn't wondering whether someone had looked inside my purse. I was wondering how much of my son's wedding had been a celebration. And how much of it had been an opportunity. I didn't confront Richard. That was the first smart decision I made. The second was not confronting Ethan. Every part of me wanted to drive straight to my son's house, put Caleb's photograph in front of him, and demand to know why his father-in-law had been anywhere near my purse. But I had spent 27 years in construction. I knew the difference between seeing a crack and knowing what caused it. So I waited. The next morning, Ethan walked into my office carrying a blue folder. He didn't sit. "We need to settle this today." "Settle what?" "The transfer." He dropped the folder onto my desk. Through the glass wall behind him, I could see employees pretending not to watch us. "Ethan, we already have a schedule." "Your schedule?" There was something in his voice I had never heard before. Not anger exactly. Resentment sharpened into certainty. I opened the folder. The first few pages looked familiar. They were from an earlier ownership transfer draft my attorney and I had reviewed months before the wedding. Then I reached the voting provisions. My stomach tightened. The document stated that I had agreed to transfer majority voting control to Ethan immediately following his marriage. I read it twice. Then a third time. I never agreed to this. Ethan gave a short, humorless laugh. "You reviewed these documents." "Parts of them." "Your initials are on the earlier pages." "Yes, because those pages are from an old draft." His jaw tightened. "Convenient." I looked up. "What does that mean?" "It means every time I get close to having real authority, the rules change." That hurt more than I expected. "Who gave you this?" He didn't answer. He didn't need to. "Richard." "Why does that matter?" "Because your father-in-law has been discussing confidential ownership details that I never shared with him." Ethan's expression changed immediately. There it was. Defensiveness. "You think this is about Richard because you can't accept that I have my own opinions." "I think Richard has been involved because he keeps appearing in conversations that concern my company." "Our company." "Legally, Ethan, it is still my company." The second I said it, I regretted it. His face went cold. "And there it is." "Don't twist my words." "I don't have to. You finally said what you actually believe." He grabbed the folder. "My title is Operations Manager. My name is Whitmore. I've given 10 years of my life to this place, and when it matters, I'm still your employee." Then he walked out. Richard arrived less than 2 hours later. That told me everything. He entered smiling, as though we were discussing a disagreement over seating arrangements rather than control of a multi-million-dollar company. "Rebecca, may I?" "You're already here." He sat across from me. "I know emotions are high." "Are they?" Ethan feels trapped. Ethan is 31. Exactly. Richard leaned back. You raised a capable man. At some point, you have to let him discover that. I intend to. After another review. Yes. Then another condition. I stared at him. You seem remarkably informed about agreements you aren't a party to. His smile remained. Ethan talks to me. And apparently shows you documents. Something flickered in Richard's eyes. Tiny. Gone immediately. Rebecca, I'm not your enemy. That was when I knew he understood I was suspicious. But I still didn't know how far he had gone. Over the next week, Ethan began making decisions without me. He cancelled a supplier agreement I had negotiated with Palmetto Stone and Millwork, a company we had used successfully for 11 years. He replaced them with a regional supplier Richard recommended. The new contract promised lower material costs. It also required enormous minimum orders and punishing cancellation fees. Claire found me in the conference room with the contract spread across the table. This is going to cost us a fortune. How much? If the Harbor Point project slows down. 200,000. Maybe more. Did Ethan run projections? Claire gave me a look. You know the answer. I called Ethan. He arrived 20 minutes later with Richard. That was becoming a pattern. We're not canceling this, Ethan said. You already cancelled Palmetto. Because their pricing is outdated. The replacement contract exposes us to hundreds of thousands in inventory risk. Richard calmly interrupted. Growth requires tolerance for risk. I turned toward him. This is a family discussion. No, Ethan said. This is exactly the problem. You call something family whenever you want everyone else out of the room. I stared at my son. Richard said nothing. He didn't have to. He had taught Ethan the language. Within days, employees began noticing the division. Questions that once came to me went to Ethan. Questions Ethan couldn't answer went to Richard. And Richard started spending more time at Whitmore Custom Homes than some of our actual consultants. Then came the investment. Ethan placed a presentation on the conference room screen. Harbor Ridge Development Partners. I had never heard of it. According to Ethan, Whitmore Custom Homes could invest $1.8 million into a development fund acquiring distressed residential lots throughout coastal South Carolina. Richard called it transformational. I called Claire. She called it insane. What exactly does Richard get? I asked Ethan. Nothing. Nothing. He introduced us. Richard folded his hands. I'm trying to help your son think beyond individual houses. I looked through the proposal. Several LLCs. Management entities. Holding companies. Too many layers. I'm freezing this. Ethan stood so quickly his chair rolled backward. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You didn't even finish the presentation. I don't need a presentation to know I'm not moving $1.8 million through entities nobody in this room has properly vetted. Richard sighed. That sigh was deliberate. Almost pitying. Ethan noticed. What? Richard shook his head. Nothing. Say it. I warned you this might happen. The room went silent. I looked at Ethan. Warned you about what? His eyes were already burning. That you would never let me do anything you didn't choose first. Ethan. You know what people call me. I froze. The owner's kid. His voice cracked. I've spent 10 years trying to prove I deserve to be here, and every time I make a decision, Claire questions the money and you question my judgment. Because sometimes your judgment needs questioning. The moment those words left my mouth, I knew I had given Richard exactly what he wanted. Ethan stared at me. Then he nodded slowly. Thank you. He reached into his jacket and placed his office key card on the table. What are you doing? I quit. My chest tightened. Don't be ridiculous. There. You're doing it again. Ethan. I'm done asking permission to become an adult. He walked toward the door. I followed him into the hallway. Please don't leave like this. He stopped. For 1 second, he looked like the little boy who used to wait beside Thomas's truck every Saturday morning begging to go to job sites. Then the expression disappeared. Madison and I have been talking about moving. My stomach dropped. Moving where? Maybe Atlanta. Maybe Nashville. Because of this? Because I need a life that isn't controlled by you. He left. Richard passed me moments later. He stopped beside me. I'm sorry. I looked at him. No, you aren't. His expression barely changed. Ethan needs independence. And you need $1.8 million. That landed. Only for a second. Then Richard smiled. You're grieving, Rebecca. Thomas built this company with you. I understand why letting go feels like losing him again. It was such a cruel thing to say because it sounded compassionate. He walked away before I could answer. That night, I sat alone in the house Thomas and I had bought before Ethan was born. I had protected the company. And lost my son. For the first time, I wondered whether Richard was right about one thing. Maybe my fear of losing control had become indistinguishable from love. At 11:18 p.m., my phone rang. Caleb. I finished reviewing the sequence. I sat upright. And there are 7 usable images. My heart started pounding. He sent them while we spoke. I opened the first. Closed purse. Second. Open purse. Third. Documents visible. Fourth. A phone hovering above them. Fifth. A man's hand turning one page. Sixth. The silver object near the papers. Then the 7th. It captured slightly more of the person's wrist. Enough to show the silver rectangle fastened at the cuff. Black stripe through the center. My breath stopped. Richard's cuff link. I remembered something, Caleb said. Mr. Clark asked me to take candidates near that hallway. I know. There's more. I scrolled backward through the photographs. What? The timestamps. Caleb explained that the entire sequence occurred in less than 90 seconds. Whoever opened my purse hadn't stumbled across those documents. He had moved quickly. Deliberately. Like he already knew what he was looking for. I stared at Richard's cuff link on my screen. Then I opened the transfer agreement Ethan had shown me. I remembered the familiar pages. My initials. The unfamiliar voting clause. And suddenly another possibility occurred to me. A worse one. What documents are visible clearly enough to read? I asked. Not everything. Can you identify any page numbers? Caleb enlarged one photograph. Page 6. I walked to my home office and opened the folder containing my copy of the pre-wedding transfer draft. Page 6 contained the ownership schedule. Page 7 contained the conditions for voting control. Page 8 contained my attorney's internal revision notes. Those were exactly the sections someone would need if they wanted to create a false agreement that looked real. I felt the last of my guilt disappear. Richard hadn't simply poisoned Ethan against me. Someone had used my son's wedding to obtain confidential information from my purse. And if the altered agreement had been built from those pages, Richard wasn't trying to help Ethan inherit Whitmore Custom Homes. He was trying to use Ethan to take it. I closed the folder. For the first time since my son resigned, I didn't feel like crying. I felt something colder. I called Claire. She answered on the fourth ring. "Rebecca? It's almost midnight. I need you at the office early." "How early?" 6. She went quiet. "What happened?" I looked again at the photograph of Richard's hand above my documents. "Bring everything we have on Harbor Ridge Development Partners." "Why?" "Because tomorrow we stop asking whether Richard Clark is interfering with this company." I closed the wedding photograph. We start finding out what he needs from it. At 6 the next morning, Claire walked into my office carrying 2 coffees, her laptop, and a banker's box full of files. She took one look at my face and locked the door behind her. "What did you find?" I turned my monitor toward her. The wedding photograph filled the screen. Claire leaned closer. "That's your purse." "Yes." "And those are the transfer documents." "Yes." Then she saw the wrist. The silver cuff link. Her expression changed. "Richard. Maybe." Claire looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Rebecca, that is his cuff link." "It looks like his cuff link." "That's not the same thing as proving what he did." 3 days earlier, I would have driven to Ethan's house with that photograph and demanded he believe me. I wasn't going to make that mistake now. Richard had spent months teaching my son to interpret every objection from me as evidence that I was controlling him. If I accused Richard without proving the entire scheme, Richard would simply turn my suspicion into another weapon. So I stopped thinking like Ethan's mother. I started thinking like the woman who had kept Whitmore Custom Homes alive after burying her husband. My attorney, Harrison Prescott, arrived at 8. By 9, Caleb had transferred the original high-resolution wedding files to him, complete with timestamps and metadata. Harrison insisted we preserve everything exactly as it had come from the camera. No screenshots, he warned. No edited enlargements as primary evidence. Originals first. Then we pulled the transfer drafts. There had been 5 versions over the previous year. The documents Ethan had shown me were a mixture. Pages 1 through 6 matched draft 3 perfectly. Page 7 did not. Page 8 returned to draft 3. Harrison placed the pages side by side. Someone substituted this. The altered page granted Ethan immediate majority voting authority following his marriage. My genuine draft required the independent financial review first. "What about the signatures?" I asked. "Copied from legitimate pages, most likely." Claire whispered, "So somebody built a Frankenstein contract." Harrison glanced at her. "Crude description. Accurate description." He didn't disagree. Then I noticed something. The photographed pages in Caleb's images were from draft 3. The same draft used to construct Ethan's suspicious agreement. That coincidence was becoming impossible to ignore. But Richard still had room to deny everything. So we kept digging. Our document management system recorded downloads. At 4:36 p.m., 12 days before the wedding, Ethan had downloaded draft 3. I felt sick. Claire saw my face. "Don't assume." I called Ethan without mentioning the investigation. "Did you download an old transfer agreement before the wedding?" Silence. Then, why? I'm reviewing the file history. Another pause. Yes. Why? Richard suggested I understand the earlier versions before negotiating with you. There it was. Not proof of forgery. But a path. Did you give him the document? No. Did you email it? No. Did he ever have access to your company account? His voice hardened. Mom, what is this? Routine review. He laughed bitterly. Nothing with you is routine anymore. He hung up. I sat there staring at the phone. Claire spoke softly. He downloaded it because Richard told him to. And Richard still needed information from my copy. Why? That question bothered me for hours. Then Harrison found the answer. My copy contained handwritten attorney notes that did not exist in Ethan's downloaded version. One note referenced a confidential restriction requiring approval before company funds could be invested in businesses connected to officers, directors, or their immediate families. That clause had never appeared in the employee-accessible drafts. Only my attorney's annotated copy. Richard hadn't just wanted ownership percentages. He needed to know what could block his money. By afternoon, Claire had begun untangling Harbor Ridge Development Partners. The structure was deliberately exhausting. Harbor Ridge invested through Atlantic Residential Growth Fund. That fund contracted with Mercer Lane Asset Management. Mercer Lane had recently acquired debt connected to a company called Clark Strategic Ventures. Claire looked at me. Guess who owns Clark Strategic Ventures? I already knew. Richard. The $1.8 million investment wasn't simply an opportunity Richard had recommended. Company money would move through multiple entities until part of it helped stabilize obligations tied to his own failing business. He's drowning, Claire said. How badly? Badly enough that he needs money soon. That changed everything. Richard's greatest weakness wasn't arrogance. It was time. So I gave him hope. 2 days later, I called Ethan. I've been thinking. About what? The transfer. Silence. I don't want to lose you over this. His voice softened slightly. Neither do I. I'm willing to discuss accelerating voting control. Another silence. This one felt different. You are? Yes. But I want one formal meeting. You, me, Claire, Harrison, Madison, and Richard. Why Richard? Because if Harbor Ridge is part of your growth strategy, I want him to present it himself. Ethan agreed. Richard called me 23 minutes later. That told me how quickly information traveled between them. I'm glad you're reconsidering, he said warmly. I may have been too cautious. Caution isn't a flaw, Rebecca. Refusing to evolve is. I almost smiled. Then help me evolve. I could hear the satisfaction in his silence. We scheduled the meeting for Monday. Until then, I acted defeated. Richard became bolder. He emailed projections. He spoke about post-transition governance. He even sent Ethan a proposed announcement describing him as Whitmore Custom Homes' incoming controlling shareholder. Richard believed he had finally found my price. My son. He was right about the weakness. He was wrong about what I was willing to sacrifice. Then, Sunday afternoon, everything nearly collapsed. Ethan came to my house unannounced. He walked into the kitchen holding a printed email. His face was furious. What are you doing? I recognized Harrison's name at the top. My attorney had accidentally copied an old company address Ethan could still access when requesting archived document logs. My stomach dropped. You're investigating Richard. Ethan. You told me Monday was about fixing this. It is. You're collecting evidence against my wife's father. I'm verifying what happened. He stared at me. Then said the words I had been afraid of. I already told him. Richard called less than 10 minutes after Ethan left. His voice was calm. Almost amused. I expected better, Rebecca. From me? Wedding photographs. Document conspiracies. You're becoming desperate. Then Madison called. She sounded shaken. I saw those documents in the bridal suite, Rebecca. My heart tightened. What? Your purse was open for a while. Papers were visible. Bridesmaids were going in and out. It was the defense Richard needed. Anyone could have seen them. Anyone could have photographed them. And Ethan believed his wife. For a few hours, I thought we had lost our advantage. Then Richard made a mistake. He called again that evening. You can bring your photographs tomorrow, he said. They prove nothing. I never said what they showed. Ethan told me. Did he? Richard paused. Then continued too quickly. You're trying to suggest I learned confidential information from those papers. But the family investment restriction on your voting transfer wouldn't even apply to Harbor Ridge. I stopped moving. The room went completely still. What restriction? Silence. Only for a second. But I heard it. Richard recovered. The clause Ethan mentioned. Ethan had never known about that clause. It was in Harrison's handwritten notes on my private copy. The copy inside my purse. I kept my voice neutral. Of course. Richard relaxed. I'm glad we understand each other. We do. After he hung up, I called Harrison. Then Claire. Neither spoke for several seconds after I repeated Richard's words. Finally, Harrison said, "Can you prove Ethan never received that annotated version?" Yes. And Richard just identified the substance of the clause. Almost word for word. Claire gave a quiet laugh. Not because anything was funny. Because after days of chasing documents through corporations, Richard had finally done something beautifully simple. He had told us he knew what was inside my purse. Monday morning, I arrived at Whitmore Custom Homes before anyone else. The conference room had 6 chairs around the table. I placed nothing in front of mine. No photographs. No files. No accusation. Richard expected me to enter that room desperate to prove he was a thief. I wasn't going to. I was going to let him explain everything. At 8:57, Ethan arrived with Madison. At 8:59, Richard walked in carrying a leather portfolio and wearing the expression of a man attending his own victory celebration. He smiled at me. Ready? I looked at my son. Then at Madison. Then at the man who had spent months studying Ethan's insecurity, my grief, and our family's weakest seams. For the first time, I understood Richard completely. He believed every person eventually surrendered if you found the right pressure point. He had found mine. He simply hadn't realized that pressure could turn something fragile into something harder. I pulled out my chair. Absolutely. Richard opened his presentation. And I let him begin. Richard spoke for 22 minutes. I let him have every one of them. He stood at the end of the conference table with Harbor Ridge's projections glowing behind him, explaining how a $1.8 million investment could transform Whitmore Custom Homes from a successful builder into a regional development company. Ethan sat beside Madison, tense but hopeful. Richard was relaxed. He thought this meeting was about convincing me to surrender. When he finished, he clicked off the screen. So, he said, I think we're finally looking forward instead of backward. I folded my hands. I have one question. Of course. How did you know about the family investment restriction? The confidence didn't disappear from Richard's face. But it froze. Ethan frowned. What restriction? I looked at him. Exactly. Richard gave a small laugh. You mentioned it. No, I didn't. Then Ethan did. Ethan shook his head. I don't know what she's talking about. Madison looked at her father. Richard's smile tightened. This is ridiculous. Harrison Prescott opened the folder in front of him. The restriction Mrs. Whitmore is referring to appeared only as a handwritten attorney note on her private copy of Draft 3. It was never entered into the electronic version available to Ethan. Nobody spoke. Richard leaned back. You brought your attorney here to interrogate me? No, I said. I brought him because you wanted to discuss ownership. I placed 2 documents on the table. One was my original transfer draft. The other was the agreement Ethan had shown me. Ethan, look at pages 6 through 8. He did. Pages 6 and 8 are identical to draft 3, I said. Page 7 isn't. Harrison slid over his comparison. The voting rights page was substituted. Ethan stared at it. That doesn't mean Richard did anything. No, I said. It doesn't. Richard immediately seized on that. Thank you. I looked at him. That's why I kept looking. Claire opened her laptop. The screen displayed our document history. Ethan downloaded draft 3 12 days before the wedding. Ethan looked irritated. I already told Mom why. I nodded. Richard suggested it. Richard shrugged. Perfectly reasonable advice. It was, I said. That confused him. I turned toward Ethan. The electronic version you downloaded didn't contain Harrison's notes. My printed copy did. Then I placed Caleb's first photograph on the table. Madison inhaled sharply. My purse sat inside the bridal suite. Open. Documents exposed. Richard barely glanced at it. That proves nothing. Madison already explained people were entering that room. I agree. A second photograph. A phone above the documents. A third. A hand turning a page. Richard's jaw tightened. You can't identify that person. Not from his face. I placed down the fourth photograph. The silver cuff link was visible. Ethan stared at it. Madison whispered, Dad. Richard laughed. It sounded convincing enough that, 6 months earlier, I might have doubted myself. You're accusing me based on jewelry? I'm showing you photographs. I was all over that hallway. I specifically asked the photographer to capture candid moments there. Yes. You did. He realized too late how that sounded. Still, Richard recovered quickly. Even if I looked at papers that were sitting openly in a bridal suite, that isn't evidence I altered anything. There it was. The admission wrapped inside the denial. Harrison noticed it too. But I wasn't finished. Claire. She turned her laptop toward Ethan. Harbor Ridge Development Partners routes investment capital through Atlantic Residential Growth Fund. So? Ethan asked. Atlantic contracts with Mercer Lane Asset Management. Richard's expression changed. Only slightly. Claire continued. Mercer Lane acquired obligations connected to Clark Strategic Ventures 4 months ago. Ethan looked at Richard. What is Clark Strategic Ventures? I watched Richard decide whether to lie. My company. Ethan went still. Claire pulled up the next record. Your company is carrying substantial private debt. If Whitmore invested in Harbor Ridge, part of that capital could ultimately strengthen entities holding or servicing obligations tied to Richard's business. That is an absurd oversimplification, Richard snapped. Then explain it, I said. He did. Or tried. He talked about liquidity, portfolio structures, indirect exposure, development vehicles. The more he spoke, the clearer it became. Finally Ethan interrupted. You told me you had no financial interest. I don't have a direct interest. That's not what I asked. Richard's patience cracked. You wanted independence, Ethan. I gave you a path toward it. With my mother's money. With company capital. My mother's company. The irony hit Ethan before anyone else reacted. For months, Richard had trained him to hate that sentence. Now Ethan was using it himself. Richard looked toward Madison. Tell them. Her face had gone pale. Tell them what? That Rebecca is doing exactly what we discussed. She's turning everything into a conspiracy because she can't release control. Madison looked at me. Then at the photographs. I knew you wanted Ethan to get control sooner. Richard's expression sharpened. Madison. But you told me it was for him. It was. You never told me your company was connected to Harbor Ridge. Richard's silence answered her. Ethan pushed his chair back. You used me. Don't be dramatic. That was Richard's fatal sentence. I watched something break in my son's expression. Richard stood. I treated you like someone capable of running this company. Your mother treated you like a child. No, Ethan said quietly. You figured out that I already felt like one. Richard stared at him. Ethan looked at the engraved pen lying beside his notebook. He had brought it to the meeting. You gave me this before my wedding. Richard said nothing. You'd already been talking to me about taking control. I was encouraging you. You were studying me. Nobody spoke. Then Richard looked at me. You still cannot prove I created that agreement. He was right. Not completely. But I didn't need to prove every possible crime in that conference room. I needed to prove enough to stop him. Harrison has preserved the original documents, the altered version, access history, and Caleb's original photographs. Claire has preserved the financial records. What happens with those materials next won't be decided by you. Richard's confidence finally disappeared. The meeting ended 12 minutes later. Harbor Ridge received nothing. Richard left alone. Madison followed 20 minutes afterward, crying. Ethan stayed. For a long time, neither of us spoke. Then he said, I'm sorry. I looked at my son. I wanted him to be right about me. I understood immediately. If he was right, Ethan continued, then I wasn't the owner's kid anymore. You never had to prove anything to him. I know that now. He swallowed. Transfer the company to me the way you planned. I'll fix this. No. His face fell. I reached across the table. Not because I'm punishing you. Then why? Because if I rescue you from the consequences of this, I'm doing exactly what Richard accused me of doing. He looked away. You want independence? Yes. Then earn it without needing me to hand you proof that you have it. Ethan didn't return immediately. 3 months passed. Then he called Claire, not me, and asked whether Whitmore Custom Homes had an opening for a project manager. Claire made him interview. I loved her for that. Madison stayed with him, but something in their marriage changed. She stopped defending Richard. She also stopped expecting me to forgive her simply because she hadn't understood the full scheme. We became civil before we became close. That was enough. I thought the story ended there. I was wrong. 6 months after the wedding, Caleb called again. He had been organizing archived images when he noticed a detail in a photograph taken before the reception. Richard was adjusting his jacket. Only one silver cuff link was visible. Caleb checked another photograph. Same thing. One cuff link. But the photograph beside my purse had shown silver near the documents. Not necessarily on Richard's wrist. I went upstairs and pulled the purse from the back of my closet. I hadn't used it since the wedding. I emptied everything onto the bed. Nothing. Then I felt something hard beneath the inner lining. There was a tiny tear near the side seam. I pushed 2 fingers inside. Something cold touched my skin. When I pulled my hand out, a silver rectangle lay in my palm. A black stripe crossed its center. Richard's missing cuff link. I sat on the edge of the bed staring at it. The earliest photographs showed Richard had already lost one cuff link before Caleb captured the documents. Which meant the silver object beside my papers wasn't simply evidence that Richard had stood near my purse. It had fallen inside. His hand had been inside my purse deeply enough to tear the cuff link loose. The thing Richard had accidentally left behind while trying to steal information had traveled home with me. Harrison handled what came next. I didn't need to. By then, I had learned something more important than how to defeat Richard Clark. I had learned where my responsibility ended. A year after the wedding, Ethan was managing projects again. Not the company. Projects. He earned back trust one decision at a time. I postponed retirement, but not because I was afraid to surrender control. For the first time, I wasn't afraid at all. On a Monday morning, before leaving for the office, I noticed Ethan and Madison's wedding album on the shelf. I opened it. There was Ethan laughing. Madison dancing. Thomas's empty place in every photograph I still wished he had lived to see. And somewhere among those beautiful images were the photographs that had nearly destroyed us. I closed the album. For years, I had believed loving my son meant protecting him from every loss. Richard understood that weakness before I did. What he never understood was that love and surrender are not the same thing. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to hand someone what they have not learned how to protect. I put the album back on the shelf, picked up my keys, and walked into Monday morning at Whitmore Custom Homes. Not as a widow guarding her husband's legacy. Not as a mother terrified of losing her only son. But as the woman who had helped build it. And this time, when I eventually chose to let it go, the choice would be mine.